welcome to the latest episode of the Utility Safety Podcast. I'm Kate Wade, the editor of Incident Prevention Magazine, and your host for this episode. Today, we welcome back Shawn Galloway to the podcast to discuss 10 new workplace trends that keep him up at night. Shawn is the Chief Executive Officer of ProAct Safety, a global consulting firm founded in 1993 with the sole purpose of helping organizations achieve and sustain safety excellence. Welcome back to the show, Shawn. How's it going?
Thanks, Kate. Great to see you again. Things are going very well, very well. I'm happy to be back again.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us again. I kind of just want to dive right in to these questions because I think this is a really interesting topic that we're talking about today. So based on my notes from prior conversations, when you say that these are new trends that are keeping you up at night, you're specifically saying that these are things you've been noticing since 2020. Obviously, that year brought the onset of the COVID pandemic. In addition to COVID, can you kind of summarize what other workplace changes you've seen in the past 5 years?
More broadly or with specificity to these kind of 10 themes here?
Well, so I think I kind of want to summarize and then go right into the 10, or if
Yeah.
you think it's better to, I just thought we kind of like preface it a little bit before we like kind of go one by one through them.
Yeah, I think when you look at from a geopolitical standpoint, the world is vastly different looking today in 2025 than it did in 2020. Even internally here, with the political divide that we continue to find ourselves in, and then that of course carries into the workplace environment. You can't separate someone's individual life experiences, how they bring themselves to work, and their own perceptual filters of just how they deal with life. They bring that to work and they interface with other people. They're already biased by the things they've experienced and how they tend to look at the world. And we don't have as much room for discourse as we used to in the past. So you tend to find more and more of these subgroups that are forming within. And in 2023, I believe it was, I was working in Australia with some organizations that in 2019, Australia became the first country that now requires management systems around psychological safety. That wasn't something we in America were even really talking about in 2019. And Australia tends to be a little bit further ahead with these types of approaches. The UAE medical system became the first organization that was then certified under the new ISO 45003 standard, which has to do with psychological safety. So these things have become really important and a topic of conversation, and what we didn't even consider as far as what does safety excellence look like and what are the components to it. But even since COVID, the remote, the hybrid work environments, our business has been remote for goodness, maybe 12, 13 years now. So all of our people, live wherever they choose to live, and we all just travel from there. But you look at what's happened now with despite the amount of energy and effort on serious injury fatality precursors and prevention, we've really flatlined. And in a couple of years, actually, the fatality rate in America has actually gone up in some of these years. But there's two things that I think are going to be beneficial there, and that's the leveraging of technology and AI, even on powered industrial trucks and in some environments, being able to leverage new technology that might just be those opportunities to make an impact on SIF that we really didn't have the opportunity before. There's been a change in organizations all over where we're focusing more on employee well-being. Some companies call it total worker health, the complete person, and that really has to do with three areas: psych safety that we just talked about, but also has to do with mental health. The suicide rate in America has been increasing over the past 10 years, which is tragic. And then I'm seeing a lot more organizations focusing on, it's been termed a lot of different things. I just refer to it as corporate nutrition. I worked with the CEO of a major engine organization, and he himself happens to be vegan. And he shared with me that he's given up on trying to make his executive staff move towards plant-based options. But what he is doing at his locations around the world is he's wanting to provide healthier choices for the workforce because whether it's knowledge workers, the reducing cognitive fog, or it's workers that are putting their hands more on tools and in the trade, just a healthier body produces, a better outcome. But my goodness, there's so many different things that I think we can all agree the world looks a little bit different here today in 25 than it did in 20. And then as we're going to be talking about today, as I started seeing more and more evidence of things that had existed before, they just become so much more common. And you tend to see what you look for. So I'm out there looking for these things, working in the utility space, but all major industries. And I'm seeing more and more evidence that these aren't just one-off situations. These aren't just singular data points that I'm running into. These are things that are happening all over. And one other thing I'll add to that is, and I'll go back to Australia, that I've seen, whether it's the mental fatigue, whether it's the stress, I've seen what I'm calling the first death of a safety professional. And when my wife and I were in Australia, we had dinner at this wonderful little restaurant, and our server turned out was trained at Juilliard, and she was a professional ballerina and toured America. And she introduced me to this phrase that I found interesting. It's called the first death of the dancer. And what happens is even if you're passionate about something that you do, at some point you might lose your passion. And when a dancer loses his or her passion, they can't perform at the level before. And it's eventual that they're going to fizzle out or decide to leave. And I'm seeing that happen from CEOs that are just becoming stressed about the environment to even safety professionals that just don't feel as though that they're making an impact, have the support, and just eventually leave and move organizations and move on to do something else. And what I've been seeing with these 10 things is they're absolutely contributory to some of our great safety professionals just no longer having the passion that they used to.
Well, so maybe now you could walk me through each of these trends and sort of talk about why these items are so concerning to you. And then maybe, talk about what are some practical suggestions, recommendations, things that people can do to, I guess, bring the community back together. Because that's a lot of what I see. And I mean, I don't know all of the 10 trends that you're talking about, but I think a lot of this is about human connection, isolation, the different ways technology has impacted us, the different way that the pandemic has, the geopolitical situation. I mean, there's all these things. And so we need help. So I would love for you to share your wisdom with us, given your background.
Yeah, and they're really in no particular order because how they're prioritized and findings when I go deep into an organization, when I'm assessing their culture, not just their safety culture, because safety is just a part of occupational culture. The more I'm finding these things, they manifest really loud in an injury because goodness somebody was injured or worse. They manifest loud when a safety event happens, but I'm also finding them manifest in quality and schedule and cost and delivery and customer service. And the takeaway I hope people will have, whether you're a safety professional, an operational leader, a superintendent, an executive, whatever it is, what we're experiencing, this is no longer a safety problem to be solved. And safety is never really going to be a value within an organizational DNA and their culture if it's delegated to the safety professional. So while we talk through these things, realize that this is something that an organization has to have a strategy from a business perspective about how to overcome any or multiple of these. Because while 10 are the themes that I'm witnessing and that I'm seeing, they all hopelessly affect each other. So one is failing engagement, falling engagement, decreased engagement, increased disengagement. My next book will be published next week, so shameless plug on this one, and it's called Shared Ownership. And my last one, the final chapter, was we're using the metaphor of building a bridge. for safety excellence and building the capacity to generate great performance, I ended with the importance of engagement. And I also ended with the importance of once you build your organization and its capacity to produce sustainable great performance, you have to be constantly on the lookout for what might affect it. You have to constantly maintain and inspect. And then a year after I wrote that book and it was published, we had the Baltimore Bridge collapse. And that was a great visual representation of you have to have the capacity to recover from unwanted and undesirable events. So what I called some of these things before I started seeing the real relevancy of it, I called them strut sappers, these things that could compromise your bridge. So engagement being one of them. And if you look at engagement, there's the engagement spectrum, I called it in the book, and you have disengagement. All the way on the far end of disengagement is somebody that wants to burn this place down. They have an intrinsic desire to hate the place that they work. And as you start moving people towards real engagement, real employee engagement, it starts at the interest. Once somebody starts to become interested in what we're doing in the EHS space, that's when incentives stop working because we're moving from an extrinsic motivator on engagement to intrinsic. And that's where we have to be careful. But we get somebody interested, then they start to buy into what we're doing. And you can't have somebody buy into something until they've had the opportunity to weigh in on it. So when we just debrief employees, work crews about where we're going, we can't expect engagement. They haven't even had the opportunity to discuss it or to understand what it's all about. Then you start getting willing participation. They're not just filling out a JSA or a JHA with the crew or having the least tenured person lead those JHAs versus sitting in the truck and filling them out on the job site. They're doing it because they see value in it. Then you start getting self ownership where I own this. And the final step that I make the argument of is shared ownership. Battle buddy, we're all in this together. Kate, even if you're struggling a little bit, I'm going to help out because I know you do the same for me because we're all in this together. And according to Gallup and all of the other indicators and measurements around this, disengagement has been decreasing. So then we experienced this in COVID, the workplace shortages and the decreased expertise. That's the next one. So that could be in the average tenure. I mean, I remember in the utility space, you go back 10, 20 years, it was not uncommon to have a crew of 20, 30-year line workers. Now you go out there and they've just punched their journeyman ticket. They're 4 or 5 years into this, and you're seeing a big gap between the knowledge, and you can't proceduralize everything on the job. So you rely on some of that institutional knowledge. You could be on a crew, not experience something unique for 20 years. You're going to experience something unique, but you'll have a unique experience. And, I've been on this crew or this construction crew of 20 years. I never ran across that one before. So the decreased expertise also in the safety profession and in the utility space, unlike some of the other industries, it's very common to move leaders around in an organization. And some companies, they have it established every 3 years or 4 years. You move around like you do in the military to understand the command. And when you have constant changes within that, the decreased expertise of knowing how to lead this right away crew or this department, whatever it might be, and even in the safety space, we're losing some of that technical knowledge. So when you have those shortages and the decreased expertise, as a result of that, you have less operational knowledge. You have less competency about how to effectively perform our tasks. Being safe and how the safe conduct of work is a part of that, but that's been a huge impact. And then when you have the decreased expertise, the decreased knowledge that's in there, I've seen a lot of new people training new people then, or you were sending some of the younger, newer people, if you will, to the trade, to journeyman school, and then they're going out and sometimes even training the more experienced individuals because the organization might not have done a good job on explaining the new way that it's being taught at the journeyman school. But more often, what I'm seeing is we don't have the ability, we don't have that knowledge, not everything is captured. So we tend to rely on new people training new people. And that can be a recipe for disaster.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to ask one question. You said that in some companies they're moving people around every 3 or 4 years so they can get to know the business. And like, where's the line between like, moving people around at some point to make sure that they learn different aspects of the business, but also keeping them in a position for enough time where they are like the knowledge leader? And because I feel like there has to be a rationale behind why companies are moving them around. And so, is there a way to strike a balance there?
I think it's a question that needs to be asked and answered at the top of the organization. Precisely to your point, what really are we trying to accomplish here, and in the sustainability of knowledge within the organization? Some utilities I've worked with, if you don't put your name in the hat, whatever it might be, to try to move up, that's actually viewed as a bad thing. You might not have a successful leadership career unless you're willing to move around. And I don't mean physically region, but just move around. You're over a right of way crew, then 3 years later, you're over a transmission crew, and then you're on in the engineering group. Some of that can certainly be beneficial, but some people also don't want to necessarily move into some of those spaces. They can really thrive at that level or in that department. And often in the military, when an officer tends to do that, the wise officers, if you will, they tap into who the non-commissioned officers are. They find out who the people are that really understand the command and understand how things work. I think the same opportunity exists here, and that's partnering with the union members or partnering with supervisors or superintendents that don't necessarily want to move up into that management rank. And it's usually the management level that tends to move around in the utility space, not necessarily on the supervisor and superintendent level. So I think that's where the opportunity exists, but also being humble enough as a manager that you need to defer to where the expertise exists in the organization. And sometimes that might be within the rank and file, or sometimes that might be that first level of management. And some of those individuals can really thrive as an excellent crew leader, supervisor, superintendent, foreman, whatever it is. And that needs to be okay, that if that's where they want to spend the remainder of their career, sure, keep professionally developing them. Don't allow them to breathe their own exhaust, continuously get better, sharpen that saw, all of that. But I think the organization needs to be able to your point, strike that balance and say, really, what are we trying to accomplish? And does our practice of moving people around hinder that objective, or does it allow us to be successful?
Thank you. That was super helpful. So let's keep going with what you were saying.
Number four then was the as a result of a lot of this, the decrease in oversight. So we have put, with changes in regulation, changes in administrative controls, changes in new enterprise resource planning software systems, observation reports, data, we're putting so much on the safety professional and so much on first line leaders. They don't have the capacity, bandwidth to be out there shaping performance and observing and giving feedback, coaching as leaders really should. And when you don't have that out there, then you tend to rely on the groupthink, you tend to rely on the expertise that exists there. And just because somebody has 20 years of experience, if there's a low probability risk that's associated with that, they may not realize that it's at risk experience all of those years. So with the decrease in oversight, then we're missing out on the opportunities to see performance that might not be aligned with the desired performance. And again, it manifests very loud. We hear about those things when a deviation turns into an injury or an incident, but that decreased oversight, I have, however, seen some interesting approaches to this. And I'll plug Georgia Power as one of the things that they did. They called their program a few years ago Eyes on the Wire, and it was an innovative approach.
Remember, we
Yeah, I
posted
think
an
they
article
published
about
that.
it.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right. Yeah, I was working with them at that time, and they brought back several retirees, and I knew several of these people. They were excellent individuals and great coaches, just to be the eyes on the wire, just to be out there. And I've since I saw that at Georgia Power, I've made that recommendation to a lot of other industries as well, where that's possible. Bring that back so we could have back to the knowledge we're talking about, make sure that we have a more successful transference of expertise there. So that decrease in oversight.
Yeah, and I
And
think there's
then
so much interest in that too, especially when you retire, you still have all this subject matter expertise and you want to still be able to be like helpful in some way, but you don't necessarily want to be working all of the hours you were working. And I think this is like a great way to balance both of those things. I will let you get back to your point.
And I would welcome anyone listening to this podcast if they have found some other creative ways to monitor work activity and provide a little bit more observation and coaching from experienced people. Please share these practices because that's how we all benefit. I've worked with organizations that have discontinued using the term best practice in lieu of the term better practice. And it's just terminology, but language shapes culture, always has, always will. And the reason they do so is because they fear if we adapt a best practice, we might stop looking for a better way. There's always going to be a better way to do things, and all progress begins by thinking differently about something. So look for those better practice, do those better practice assessments. So going back then into the decrease in oversight, I mentioned this a little bit with the addition of administrative controls, the addition of process and paper driven activities. About 15 years ago, I was leading a workshop at National Safety Council, and somebody came up with this idea. And I wish I could remember who she was because I want to give her credit, but it was a great idea. She posed the question: what if we started measuring our corrective actions against our hierarchy of controls? And we took that and ran with it in a lot of organizations. And what we find is probably no surprise with the 80/20 rule. Generally, what we find is 80% of the corrective actions following an incident is putting more paperwork and PPE on people. And this becomes particularly challenging, and I would say introduces more error traps when we're relying on less experienced people, when we have new people training new people, relying on an administrative control, a policy, a procedure, or somebody, let's be honest, at their discretion of putting some PPE on because there's a lot of lone work activity that takes place. I think we're creating additional unintended error traps by doing this. So rather than going back and pushing back, even if we don't have an engineered solution, a substitution, elimination, even if we don't have an engineered solution to this, we should at least call that out in how we're measuring to see what percentage of this and at least push back a little bit rather than so easily the retrain or update the procedure on this. Maybe start looking back and saying, is there a different way that we can perform this task? Because technology and tools are developed all the time. At at your trade show, at a lot of the other trade shows, I've seen some really cool gadgets and tools that help out worker safety that didn't exist every single year. But if we're continuously looking for that, and some companies I know maintain what they call the someday file. And really, what it means is we don't know how to solve it, but we put it in the someday file. And at least once a year, they open that someday file up, and maybe a new engineer, or a new person has joined that figured out how to tackle it at another utility. So as long as you keep those things fresh there. Then with all of these items, the overwhelming evidence of normalization of deviance. This was coined by sociologists following the Challenger incident that these deviations started happening during the shuttle launches and they started to become norm. They were no longer as concerning and they became normed within the space program at the time. So, normalization of deviance is essentially when deviating from the norm becomes the norm, but it also becomes normalized even by those in leadership positions. And I think when I go to a job site, you tend to see evidence of that very glaringly in housekeeping practices and how clean the job site is, or how clean the utility truck is, where the tools are put away. But when you have less oversight, when you have new people training new people, less operational knowledge, there are more opportunities for things not to go to plan. And we want things to go to plan. We expect things will go to plan. The military teaches that no first battle plan survives contact with the enemy because the enemy hasn't voted yet. So we want things to go to plan, but as the DOE introduced in human performance improvement and HP and human and organizational performance, one of the first principles is that mistakes are normal in a complex environment. People are going to make mistakes. And generally, when that initial deviation occurs from how the work's supposed to go to plan, the blue line versus the black line, we generally don't hear about that until an incident, a near miss, an event happens. And then we realize where our preventative measures weren't as effective. We need the recovery capacity to bring us back to the pre-incident state, prevent that from ever happening again. But I am seeing when I'm watching work, when I'm riding with crews, I'm seeing a lot of examples about things that don't go to, or how the work is done compared to how the work is planned, is I'm seeing a wider gap. And it'll be hard to address that unless we have leaders, the eyes on the wire, whatever it is, periodically looking at work as it's performing in a way that one organization dealt with this. If you think about the state of Missouri, their motto is the show me state. So one of their practices they deploy is called show me audits. Now, audit isn't always the best term for it, but they call them show me audits. And really what that means is, hey, Kate, show me how to operate that piece of equipment. Show me how to tie this in, whatever it is. They're not looking for fault. What they're looking for is, can you still perform the task in accordance with how it's designed? Are you developing any different habits, or are things causing or influencing you to conduct the work otherwise? So we need to go back and figure out a way, whether it's again that eyes on the wire, for us to try to identify where those deviations are. And that's, to me, I call this leadership capacity. Do we have the capacity for our leaders to align our people to the performance expectations, but also be out there as the work's being performed to identify, are any deviations, even unintentionally, are any deviations occurring there? And then with this, and I mentioned that with kind of the first step as a safety professional, number 7 then is the heightened anxiety, stress, and the mental health concerns. It came out pretty loud in COVID because people were dealing with a lot of different things. But and I know during COVID, the first 2 people that I lost were, unfortunately, they took their own lives for many different circumstances before I lost anyone from the actual COVID itself. But this is driven, I think, with good intent, more organizations paying attention to the health part of EH&S, and not just looking at occupational health, but really making sure that we have employee assistant programs that are much more robust, that even normalize talking to a therapist. And a lot of people are taught, and that's just how they're raised, that it's, you have a problem if you have to talk to somebody, and that's certainly not the case. And I saw that a lot in the utility space, as well as other industries. So the heightened stress as a result of a lot of things we've talked about, the increased anxiety, and there's another term that I wrote an article about recently that I discovered starting back again in COVID, that was originally coined by Dr. Jonathan Shea when he was the head of the VA, and he was looking at soldiers returning from Vietnam. And in Vietnam, they were led, some of these soldiers, to conduct some operations that really messed them up. And this is different than PTSD. The term is moral injuries. And it's an injury that occurs that affects you at the moral level. And in the hospital system, having to turn away patients because we need space for ventilator capacity, not treating this cancer because we're not able to bring people in for elective surgeries and all this other stuff. But with the things we're talking about here and the heightened stress and the push on all these other competing important objectives like DE&I and everything else, I have talked with so many different leaders that are concerned about triggering somebody, are concerned about any potential backlash, about holding people accountable. And that's been the challenge with psychological safety, because there still has to be accountability. We want people to safe to talk about the things that aren't working, the things that concern them, but there still needs to be an accountability piece of this. And accountability isn't just results, and it's not just for lack of consequences. It's also positive consequences. And we did get our results, but the moral injury I've seen that manifest in a lot of organizations where some leaders have been honest with me that sometimes it's easier just to not say anything to the individual about something that I'm seeing, a behavior that's of concern, versus the backlash that I've seen from HR or legal or any of these others. Then that leads us to eight, which is the increase in fatalities. So we talked about that in the beginning of this, that despite all of this work, despite all the things that we're doing to drive the total recordable incident rate down, and the world has had a downward trending curve over the last 20 years. Most of the utility space has had that downward trending curve from a frequency standpoint, but not from a severity standpoint. So I think that needs to that should prompt us to go back and look at things differently, that what we're doing isn't working. We know the behavioral definition of insanity, doing the same things over and over again, expecting different results. So I think we need to look at this a little bit differently than we had before. And then number nine has to do with the continuing supply chain disruptions. And 10 has to do with, despite all of these things that we're talking about, and despite the population and footprint changing, people moving further out of the cities, developing land, which impacts the grid, more capacity needs to be available. We still have to hit our production targets. We still have to hit our safety targets. We still have to do all these things that are required of us. And now, more recently, during COVID, the supply chain disruptions were an impact. When we were going into the potential port strikes for the longshoremen union, I was concerned about, is that going to affect us again? But I work with a lot of organizations on the manufacturing side as well that produce equipment that's used in the utility space, that now the tariffs, which again, not a political statement, but the impact of the tariffs are definitely uh, already starting to impact supply chain disruptions. So all these things we're talking about, and yet we still have to hit our safety targets. We still have to have this improvement.
It's not a political statement, but I mean, at a certain point, we also have to recognize that whatever leadership is happening in our country is also impacting what happens in our workplaces, what happens in our homes, because there is such a divide. Like that is impacting us too, because maybe someone 20 years ago who you would never have even thought of having a political conversation with, like now you're like, oh, well, this guy thinks this, and then it creates divide in the workplace. And I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about is like they're all, these trends that you're pointing to. I mean, what do you say when somebody's like, wow, that's a really overwhelming list? What can I do to kind of calm myself down and not get so overwhelmed that I don't know how to move forward? You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. And, we certainly don't want to come across as, chicken little, the sky is falling. But
Right.
these are things that definitely can impact desired performance in any operating category as well as safety. So I think we need to look at, do do one or many of these exist in the organization? Where do we have evidence of this? And then collectively come together across operations, including the risk and safety professionals, and say, what's our plan? What are the things we need to do to prevent this, or perhaps even turn this around? And so what I would do is prioritize based on, the perceived impact of this. But also, I think if you really boil it down, it comes down to focusing on creating excellence and competency in three areas. One is, what's our confidence in our system capacity to prevent unwanted events, but recover when they occur? So, and this goes back to the serious injury fatality. This goes back to the normalization of deviance. That, do we have confidence that our systems, the efficacy of our systems, that they're supposed to do what they're supposed to do? So this means we need to be out there going to Gembo. We need eyes on the wire. We need to be out there to look at work as it's being performed. So A, what's our level of confidence in our system capacity to prevent and to recover? Do we have good plans? If you've got a crew that's out there and I ran into this with electronic work permitting, electronic JSAs, that they would get out there as they were first kind of being piloted, and they didn't have cell signal. So then didn't have access to, identify where the helicopter landing point is, who all the people are that need to be briefed on this, et cetera. So maybe we need redundancy in systems, and maybe we need to go back to paper-based in some form or fashion. So A, what's our confidence and the capacity to prevent? Do we have confidence that we're leveraging the right hierarchy of controls versus more administrative and PPE controls placed upon people? And then are we drilling? Are we doing scenarios? Are we contingency planning? The what if things don't go to plan? What's our response to this? And more training tends to occur on desired operations than what happens if we have a deviation. One example of this, which is just terrible in America, is having the active shooter drills. Everybody can probably recite run, hide, fight, but
Yep.
not a lot of organizations practice. And I've been in utilities where they even have to remind people that even if you're not supposed to, don't go grab your weapon out of your vehicle because now you become the active shooter to respond to this. So I've seen those conversations
Wow.
occur. So again, go back to, do we have that capacity, the system capacity? The next one is, how can we strengthen our leadership capacity? And that's two areas. How confident are we that we're aligning the workforce with the expectations? And I don't just mean results expectations, I mean the harder expectations, and that's behavioral or performance expectations. Okay, you and I as humans, we do a much better job aligning other humans to our results expectations than we do our behavioral expectations. And in psychology, they point out that all disappointment's based on a set level of expectations. If you've ever been disappointed, it's because the expectations weren't being met. And even in projects, I tend to find they don't fail in the beginning, or they don't fail in the end. They fail in the beginning, usually because of misaligned expectations. So being better at communicating, three-way communication. One organization I'll work with says, okay, tell me what you heard me say, just to validate the information was at least received. Okay, how does that sit with you? How are you going to use that information to accomplish this task? So ensuring there's alignment with performance expectations. But then on the other side to that is having leaders, someone at least, experienced individuals out there occasionally at least looking at the work as it's being performed to identify those deviations before they produce the unwanted event. And then the third has to do with, most important one, daunting task, if you will, for these 10 areas, and that's the cultural capacity. Do we have confidence of what gets reinforced in the absence of those that can do the enforcement? What peer-to-peer conversations are occurring? And how can we look for evidence that employees are discussing these issues? They're coaching each other on these things. And I find by focusing on those three capacities, they start to address these trends, because I've been working with organizations that have been putting an increase in controls, an increase in capacity building in those three areas. And yes, they will address these 10 themes that we're talking about here today, but it's also going to address a lot of the other areas in our desired performance as a leader.
This has been awesome, like super informational. There's so much good stuff in here. Before we kind of close this out, do you have any final words, anything else you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I think that as we get better and better at occupational safety, the organizations that truly mature and truly care, I think, are going to have the more significant impact in the total worker. And by that, I mean off the job. And the organizations that truly spend time with these types of capacities that we're discussing, employees take this stuff home. There was a there was a group that I worked with a long time ago. We helped them establish their first safety committee. It was employee led. Anthony was the chairperson of this. We were returning after a few years, and he was deciding he was going to go ahead and step down, not because he lost his passion, but he had two teenagers that were going to be graduating high school in the next couple of years. And this individual actually subscribes to your magazine and some of the other safety magazines to bring ideas to work. We'd love to have more employees like that. But he kind of buttonholed me when I got there one time, and he said, it was all planned for announcing that I was going to step down from this committee to spend more time with my kids until this weekend happened. So I'm thinking, oh my goodness, what happened? He said on Saturday, it took him a while to get his son Alan off the couch to go mow the lawn. Probably all had conversations like that. But he's in the garage. He hears the lawnmower turn on. And as he moments later, lawnmower turns off and his son walks in the garage and everything okay? And his son said, oh yeah, I just forgot my PPE. Huh. On Sunday, his daughter Jennifer was, I think, 15 at the time. She didn't have her driver's license, and essentially asked, would it be okay if my friends come pick me up and we'll go spend your money? We'll go to the mall or whatever it is the teenage girls do these days. So that Sunday, he's sitting on the couch. He leaves. And about 15 minutes later, she walks back in and he jokes, Daddy joked back so soon. And she said, I'm not going anywhere with those idiots. None of them will wear their seatbelt. And what he shared with me is it wasn't until I was about to get off this committee that I realized its value and what I've done to help my family members be safe. He no longer sits at the helm. He's given somebody else that, but he's still involved in this. And myself, just because of how I look at my own my own things, I looked at that and said, how did I not allow him to see that value that he's experiencing with the people he cares about the most? So it's all about relationships. It's all about the people that those that we work with care about the most. And that's really my final challenge is we have to continue to advance on injuries at work and reducing fatalities at work, but you're significantly more likely to get injured outside of work than at work. And if we really truly care about our people, let's help their family be safe also.
Shawn, thanks so much for your time today. As a reminder to our listeners, if you'd like to reach out to Shawn, we posted his contact information on our website, which can be found at utilitysafety.podbean.com. Until next time, stay safe and be well. The views, information, and opinions expressed during this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Utility Business Media and its employees. It is strongly recommended that you discuss any actions or policy changes with your company management prior to implementation.